Welcome to Proof Points, a podcast by Latham High-Tech Seeds. Family-owned and farm-proven for more than 75 years, Latham Seeds is growing strong. Now, here's product manager and host of Proof Points, Steve Sick.
All right, today on Proof Points, I'm joined by a very special guest, Dr. Greg Tylka of Iowa State University. Dr. Tylka is considered by many and myself as the leading expert in the United States on soybean cyst nematode, and I'm honored to have him on the show today. Welcome, Dr. Tylka.
Thank you, Steve. I'm honored to be here.
Oh, glad to have you. So one of the things we noticed this year driving around throughout the country was everybody looked like we had an extreme year for iron chlorosis. What were your thoughts on that as we dug a little deeper into the situation?
Well, at this stage in my career, I find myself in front of a computer more than I find myself in the field. But I can tell you from experience and also from hearing from my field crew who travel over 20,000 miles a year in the state of Iowa, tending plot work, that it was a bad year for soybean cyst nematode. And I think what I'm hearing in situations, just as you described, where farmers wondered if they had worse IDC, is two things. One is that apparent damage might be mistaken as IDC when it is soybean cyst nematode, because their soybean cyst nematode is on the rise, and we can get into that in following questions if you want to. But the symptoms are kind of the same, stunted and yellowing. The other thing is soybean cyst nematode does its thing much, much better in high pH soil. So those two things together, if a farmer knows where his or her high pH spots are, and then they see this extra stunting and yellowing, it's a logical conclusion to jump to. But there's really one distinguishing factor that is kind of a way to cheat and figure out, of course, the way to figure it out is soil sampling.
Right.
But a way to cheat is timing. So I've learned over the 33 years I've been at Iowa State that if I get phone calls in June about stunted yellow beans and wanting to test for SCN, I know they're talking to the wrong person. So soybean cyst nematode stunting and yellowing doesn't happen in June or the first half of July. It starts to appear the second half of July. And of course, this is with normal planting. Right. And then it just grows into August and September. So if the things that are being relayed to the companies about apparent worse IDC are related to those observations in late July, August, and September, not without a doubt, but I'm not a betting man, but if I were, I would bet that it's soybean cyst nematode and not iron chlorosis.
Do you think that was amplified this year because of the weather we had with the dry weather?
Yes, that's another factor. And that is that soybean cyst nematode reproduces much, much better in dry soils. And so we've just touched on the two things that are the only two things that are universally consistent for soybean cyst nematode. Everything else, is kind of not black and white, but you can talk about trends. With soybean cyst nematode, the two things it loves is high pH soil, which lends itself to iron chlorosis, or locations with iron chlorosis, I should say, and dry weather. So I wonder if both factors were at play. And so we've harvested our research plots from throughout the state, and we know the yields, but we haven't processed all the soil samples yet. But I'm expecting astronomically high end of season egg counts from our research plots because of the dry growing season.
When you take soil samples, do you recommend taking cyst, samples and testing for cyst at the beginning of the year and then at the end of the year, or just at the end of the year so you know what to kind of do for next year?
Yeah, we do beginning and end of the season, so we can measure changes in varieties or seed treatments or whatever. For a farmer, it depends on what they want. So if a farmer has harvested soybeans and is disappointed in the yields and usually soybean cyst nematode is the last thing they'll consider.
Mhm.
They've eliminated most everything else, and then they should pull a soil sample from soybean stubble this fall, and it might surprise them and help explain the yields that they got this growing season. If they live in an area where soybean cyst nematode is prevalent, and by the way, we, in 3 independent surveys over 2 decades, found SCN in 70% of Iowa fields.
Wow.
But if they live in an area that soybean cyst nematode is present, and they're growing soybeans next year, they could sample fields of corn stalks this fall, so they know what's waiting for them for next year's soybean crop. And probably the worst thing you could do, although I know there's some economic reasons starting to develop for doing it, continuous soybeans. I mean, I spent my whole career dissuading people, begging them not to grow continuous soybeans. But with the new uses of soybeans, renewable airline fuel, and others, there's an increase in market demand predicted. And so I think we'll find ourselves at some point here in the future talking about continuous soybeans. And that's not a pleasant prospect for fields that have soybean cyst nematode.
Right. No, I agree. I mean, one of the things we've done at Latham is we've really started to increase our portfolio as far as Peking varieties. Obviously, we need to rotate cyst sources. Is there any other thing we could do as an industry or as a farmer to help manage our cyst populations?
Well, you've hit on the main one, and it's Peking resistance. And in the past, we've alluded in my management recommendations, alluded to trying to find Peking. I track the number of varieties, cyst-resistant varieties every year, and the number of Peking varieties has doubled for this year compared to last year. And so I'm about to start talking about my message for 2024 is everybody should start growing Peking. Nobody should ever grow it continuously. In other words, we can't switch from 88788 to Peking. We always need to rotate those 2 sources because Peking will not be as durable as 88788. Farmers are going to see a 15 or 20 bushel per acre yield surge when they switch to Peking. And so I like money. Farmers like money. That's why they farm. And so the temptation is going to be to switch whole hog into Peking. And that is very short-sighted. That Peking will lose its effectiveness, we think, quicker, at least twice as quick as 88788, if not 3 times as quick. So we need to keep 88788 around, and we need to start using Peking, and then we always need to rotate with corn. So that's the base. Now, you asked if there are other things. The other thing that is easy to think about is seed treatments. So there are a half a dozen or more nematode protectant seed treatments that farmers can purchase to use on their soybeans. And we do field research funded by the Soybean Checkoff to look at those as well as the resistant varieties. And our results are variable. And I can't explain why sometimes we see a 5 bushel increase with a seed treatment and other times we can't. It's even within the same year, but different among the 9 main locations we do research. So because of that, I don't just blanketly say, use any seed treatment. I encourage farmers and agronomists, seed company agronomists who work with farmers to start trying to figure it out on individual farms and use a couple different ones and do a little bit of science. I know farmers are tremendously good at observations. So they're the world's best scientists in practice. And so they need to apply those skills to these seed treatments. And I think I can't possibly do enough experiments to generate data to support every farmer in Iowa. And so farmers and agronomists who work with farmers need to take that responsibility on themselves a little bit and start looking at these things more critically or scientifically, because there are ones that are going to boost the yields and bottom line of soybean production for farmers.
You know, there's been a lot of work done over the years on corn rootworm, managing corn rootworm. Do you think soybean cyst nematode is kind of falling behind the curve as far as, work being done by the industry, work being done by different groups? And then as second part to that question is, what do you think is, or what's coming, as far as any new work, any new sources of resistance?
Oh, so there's a lot of stuff wrapped up into there. So the short answer to your first part of your question is, without a doubt, we have fallen behind. And it's been extremely frustrating for me. My world revolves around soybean cyst nematode and helping farmers. And so we've known this problem with 88788 was brewing for decades. Mm-hmm. Now, I try to be respectful. Seed companies are a business. They can't just do stuff willy-nilly. And so they have to make the proper business decisions. But they have been slow to come to market with Peking resistant varieties. Mm-hmm. We knew it was going to help. Soon as some of them became available, we created experiments to test them, and they shone through. They verified what we thought was going to happen, but the industry lagged behind. And I'm really uplifted to see that our list of resistant varieties this year, the number of Peking varieties has doubled since last year. So we are at 87 different Peking varieties across maturity groups 1, 2, and 3. Now, there's no Peking varieties for the bottom tier of counties in Iowa, the mid to late group 3s, but we're making progress.
Right.
So that's uplifting to me. Now, there is wonderful support of SCN research, including breeding with new sources of resistance by the soybean checkoff. The Iowa Soybean Association is a leader. The North Central Soybean Research Program is a leader. The United Soybean Board funds a lot of work and work I'm involved with soybean cyst nematode to bring to market or to make available new breeding lines with different sources of resistance. But there's a giant, a critical point between our research and it's showing up with farmers, and it's the seed companies. Right. So all this research that we're doing, showing which things seem to be promising and which don't, it will all be for naught if the seed companies don't adapt that or adopt that and put it into their portfolios. And I understand that, and I tell this to my audiences, that when you want to breed a new soybean variety with new SCN resistance for a company, it's not like you just cross an existing variety with one and you're done. So it's a process. And right. So the reason we've had PI 88788 for 25 years is that's what's been in the breeding program. Mm-hmm. So it showed up in the early 90s, and we did a great job. We, being the industry, did a great job of bringing 88788 varieties to market. But then herbicide resistance took over. And farmers, with no disrespect, but farmers are way more interested in herbicide resistance technologies than SCN resistance. So right. As seed companies develop more and improve varieties into the 2000s and 2010s and this decade, everything in their program, their breeding program, had 88788. So to get more Peking into new varieties, it takes more work, and more work is more time, and seed companies are business. So I get it all, but I'm paid by the university and supported by the checkoff to keep my finger on the pulse of the SCN situation. And I sense the pulse is getting a little stronger, but we have a lot more we could do in the realm of Peking cyst resistant varieties and then bringing something new as well.
You mentioned different sources of resistance. I mean, how close are we to getting some different sources of resistance out there?
Not very close, according to my conversations. There's lots to pick from, but a source of resistance might have really good nematode control, but it's got terrible agronomics. Many of them are black seeded. Many of them fall over. They don't grow upright. So there's a lot of biological reasons why we don't have 8 different sources of resistance in seeds that you can purchase. So there's a tremendous amount of work in sorting out and capturing those useful genes from a source of resistance called PI 437654, which is probably the most effective resistance that we know of. But it also is the most terrible agronomics of all the sources of resistance. So yeah, it's frustrating because we have these genes as potential in these breeding lines, but they're so bad in so many other respects that it's a Herculean effort to cross them into agronomically acceptable or very good soybean varieties and get the best of both worlds. And that's been the story for nearly 30 years. Now, the final that pops through my mind on this is molecular technology and identifying resistance genes and possibly being able to precisely move resistance genes from breeding lines into highly productive soybean lines. And we have a lot of scientists, very talented scientists at Iowa State and at other universities, lots of soybean checkoff funding supporting those efforts. And that might be a big break in the logjam. I can't say that we can see that break yet in the near future, but we may not see it until it happens. And so there are molecular researchers working on this, trying to figure out ways to precisely identify and excise or cut out and put in more useful, different resistance genes in soybean varieties.
Another question that I get quite a bit is, and we're seeing quite a bit in certain areas, is the use of cover crops. Obviously for putting nitrogen back into the ground, fertility, things like that. Do you see any difference in, cyst population, cyst control by using the cover crop? Do we change that a little bit?
Yeah, I can't say that cover crops don't affect SCN numbers, but it's really hit or miss. And in my limited research of just a dozen maybe experiments, is it more misses than hits. And so I can't say on record that cover crops will never reduce your SCN numbers, but I can go on record to say that they will not always reduce your SCN numbers, and the odds are less likely than more likely. And it's very specific. The leading cover crops that I've read scientific literature about that show promise are cereal rye, annual rye, and daikon radish. But in the radish category, it's not all varieties of daikon radish. It's certain varieties. So those are the three that there are reports in the scientific literature. But those reports, those papers in the literature, they themselves show like a 25% occurrence of reduced nematode numbers. Right. So my final comment on cover crops to farmers is grow cover crops for the appropriate reasons. They're wonderful for conservation, keeping soil in place, tying up nutrients for use next year. And if you get some nematode control, that's a bonus. But that shouldn't be the linchpin of your SCN management strategy is cover crops.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
In Dr. Tylka's ideal world, what would be your rotation strategy as far as corn, soy, different modes of action?
Yeah, it's very simple. Corn, soybeans with Peking resistance, corn, soybeans with 88788 resistance, and then repeat.
Yeah. Would you throw a seed treatment in there as well?
Yes, but I would. Well, I'm a scientist, so I would throw that in every soybean year and put some strips out to get a feel for what seems to work in my fields. And I've done over 200 field experiments over the last 9 years with seed treatments. And I've seen great yield increases. I've seen some reductions in nematode numbers, and I've seen no rhyme or reason, geography-wise, weather-wise. I just can't wrap my head around it. And so the default is that farmers and agronomists need to figure it out on their own on a local basis. And they can work, and they can be a valuable management strategy. So contrast that with my comments on cover crops. So right. I don't think a seed treatment is a random shot in the dark like cover crop is, but I don't think it's a guarantee either. And farmers and agronomists should work unless they just think it's worth the investment to put a seed treatment on all the time, which that's a decision that they can make. Otherwise, I think some keen observation is needed to hone in on what seems to work in an individual farm operation for seed treatments.
Okay. One final question. is, with the varying soil types we have across the state, are you seeing a increase in numbers by a certain soil type? Obviously, soil types can vary by field, things like that.
Well, I don't know a lot about soil types. I have to admit I've never had a full semester soil science class. Actually, that's not true. I probably did back when I didn't have enough perspective to understand. I was memorizing information and not really learning it. But there are two soil types I've already alluded to. So one is high pH. So that Clary and Nicolette Webster lobe of soil through north central Iowa down into central Iowa. That's soybean cyst nematode heaven because of pH. Soybean cyst nematode was first found in Winnebago County, Iowa in 1978. That's like at the top of that lobe in Iowa. And it really has thrived in that lobe of soil. And then the other one we've talked about is dry soils. Well, in southeast Iowa, we work in some sandy fields. And soybean cyst nematode goes nuts in sandy fields. So we do research every year around the Muscatine area, and we see the highest reproductions. We see 22 bushels per acre yield difference between Peking and 88788, and that shows the extreme yield potential because soybean cyst nematode goes so crazy in sandy soil. So those are the only two that I could speak to is high pH soils, which makes me think Clary and Webster lobe, and then sandy soils in southeast Iowa. And there may be sandy soils in other places in Iowa.
I guess one additional question that just popped into my head. What is the highest cyst count you've seen?
Yeah, I'm almost hesitant to say it because I've only ever seen it once, but it was real. And it was like 365,000 eggs per half a cup of soil. I would say a routine, very high egg count that we would see in our research or in samples submitted by farmers would be more like 20,000. That would catch my attention, 20,000 or 18,000. But we used to have in the laboratory a note scribbled on a piece of paper for the record, and it was like 325 or over 300,000. The note fell off the wall, and I've since forgotten what the egg. That was over 300,000.
Wow.
Yeah.
Did soybeans even grow in that field?
Yeah, that's the thing. Soybean cyst nematode is an obligate parasite. It needs living soybeans to reproduce. And at that level, I mean, I can't imagine what the soybeans looked like. They were probably this tall at harvest time. And that has to affect the ability of the nematode to build up its numbers. So SCM is a fascinating critter. I never imagined I would spend my entire career focused on that, but I've loved it, Joe.
No, we obviously appreciate all the work you've done and what Iowa State's done for us. So, and with that, we appreciate you tuning in to this week's episode of Proof Points, and we'd really like to thank Dr. Tylka for his time today. Thank you, and appreciate everything you've done.
Well, thank you, Steve. I've enjoyed talking with you.